What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at my top 8 early decks that are succeeding in High Infinite after the patch. Starting with Gamer's Technoorganic Virus Victoria Hand deck. Now, I've been a big evangelist for Lee Hand because Lin Lee adds a dimension of verticality that typically the V Hand list isn't particularly capable of on its own. But Technoorganic Virus might be another good solution for that. There's a bunch of things that work with Technoorganic Virus in this list. First of all, a lot of your cards are just on reveals that sit on the board after they've done that, making them ripe targets for infection by the Technoorganic Virus. Second of all, you have a Quinjet in the deck, which means that you're going to be able to play a 1-cost TOV and then another 1-cost TOV. Third, you have Moon Girl, which allows you to copy TOV in your hand, play 2 1-cost TOVs, and then if you have a Quinjet, 2 more 1-cost TOVs. That's quite good. Giving all the stuff in a lane plus 4 is very, very reasonable. Now, this means that you are getting a different method of going tall from the typical Lee Hand list, and I think that it is a very reasonable addition to the list. There's some other things that this allows you to do, but largely Victoria Hand's problems are almost always related to how do I go tall without consuming board space? And a skill that adds as much power as Technoorganic Virus can means that it's a naturally good fit in this archetype. Now, there are a couple of flex slots here. Like I have a Red Guardian in here. Gamer had a Deafening Chord. I think if you really wanted to lean into the TOV thing, maybe you could play a Mobius or a Black Cat or something of that nature. There's a lot that you can do with that spot specifically, but I do think a lot of the rest of the deck is kind of locked in. Another thing Technoorganic Virus does help with a little bit is Gambit Horseman of Death. The cards created by Technoorganic Virus, or the copies I should say, will count for Gambit, but of course they will count only as 1 cost no matter how much energy you actually spend to play them. That is, of course, the opposite side of the interaction that allows Valentina and Iron Patriot to be so compelling. But having another card that is going to create cards is kind of important in certain draws that this deck is going to have. There are going to be draws where you don't have Moon Girl, you don't have Valentina, and you've got to cobble it together out of an Iron Patriot, a Maria Hill, and a Technoorganic Virus. And that's sometimes a very real thing that is actually going to happen. And having your ability to go tall tied to a card that still ties into activating your Gambit, as opposed to with Lin Lee where it very often does not, or almost always does not in the absence of a Frigga or a Moon Girl, that is a really notable thing. I think that this is a potentially serious alteration to the list that really addresses some of the things that TOV does specifically well that V Hand doesn't do specifically well. Like, I always talk about how Victoria Hand's biggest weakness is that it is a deck that consumes a lot of board space and needs the ability to go taller. So a skill adding power to the board is kind of exactly in the wheelhouse of what it's looking for. I think most people who watch this channel enough will be familiar with Denish's Hela list. They all kind of look the same, but Hela did get a bit of a stealth buff in the OTA thanks to the way she now picks out targets. Basically, what matters for this deck is when you pull a Ghost Rider, it will then pull a card, and if it pulls a card that Hela had targeted, now Hela will go back and pull a different card. So Ghost Rider in your Hela pool is now better than it used to be. That's a good thing. But what I find actually most notable about this deck is how clearly it is acknowledging that this is not really the metagame for Hela to succeed in. And the 2 cards that acknowledge that the most are Super Giant and Alioth. The reason this is an acknowledgement of that is down to what the metagame actually is. Largely, Hela succeeds when metagames are very mid-rangey, when it can just show up, run people over, because it's a difficult deck to interact with, it's hard for a lot of mid-range decks to play a Stardust, and it can just outpoint a lot of things. Unfortunately, in this metagame, there are cards like Sholo and decks like Star-Lord that are able to actually meaningfully go over the top of that, and that's to say nothing of decks that are just able to play a card like Iska, for example, and get a billion triggers on it and not really care at all about how many cards you revived in that lane. There are some meaningful threats to Hela's dominance, because Hela is a deck that is best when it is bigger than all the mid-range decks and other combo decks aren't around. But That's not really the metagame we live in. And so Super Giant is an acknowledgement of that. If you want to beat Star-Lord, a deck that is very often going to try to take priority, Alioth 2 lanes and Juggernaut another one, you need to be able to turn that off, and Super Giant does that. Now, you can also YOLO Gambits into the Star-Lord. That'll work some of the time, but Super Giant is a very clear answer to that. If you want to have a middling game and drag Sholo down to Earth, Super Giant does that. That's a very important thing here. And that all allows this deck to be a little bit more adaptive than you would expect from a Hela list. This is not necessarily the exact right time to play Hela, and those cards indicate it, but those cards also indicate a very real willingness to adapt to what the metagame is, rather than just hoping it becomes a good time to play the deck. Another bug fix here, this time for Peni Parker and Multiple Man. Now, the way this one works is before a couple of weeks ago, if you tried to put the spider onto a Multiple Man while you had, say, an Iron Fist effect queued up, you would get 2 Multiple Men, but only one of them would retain the spider effect of being able to move. This is now no longer true, meaning that you can make plays like move a spider, or queue up a Nico move into a spider, or play a spider into an Aranya, and that will give you 2 9-power Multiple Men. That's a big addition to what a deck like this is typically able to do. It's a big floor raiser. It makes you a lot less reliant on a bunch of specific stuff. This list comes from Jet, the Phoenix Force maestro himself, who has usually evolved past this kind of Phoenix Force deck. It's interesting that he's back here because of this bug fix. Jet is the guy who sort of pioneered this style of Phoenix Force way back in the day when Phoenix Force first became a 4/5. Fun fact, Phoenix Force released as a 5/6. Yeah, remember that one? Probably not. Now, this is a deck that is notably good at power output and is notably weak to people interacting with it. So you see that Alioth in there, right? That's a very reasonable conclusion to come to. The way this deck tends to work is you'll get into a final turn where you have so many more points than anyone that the only way they'd possibly stay is if they were doing something to take those points away or to invalidate them. And a lot of decks are going to be vaguely capable of that. But since your points are almost always located on the board, you've been doing things like moving Phoenix Forces around, you can use Alioth to protect your board from whatever it is they're doing. They have a Shadow King showing up, very awkward for you, but definitely beatable. There's also a secondary win condition in this list, which is basically using Phoenix Force to revive a launched Fastball Special Human Torch that you put the entire game into moving. That's a very reasonable thing to do. Human Torch can get to like 48 power in a deck like this fairly reasonably, and obviously that's just going to be enough. You don't need to be playing Adamantium Infusion for Fastball Special and a 4-cost revive to win when the base card is going to be as big as that card is going to be. So that is your sort of backup win con, and you have that backup win con, and also realistically the backup win condition that is just playing a Multiple Man and Peni Parkering it a decent amount of the time. Like, a couple of 9s running around is nothing to sneeze at. It's not the greatest win condition you've ever had, but it's a whole plan that we really didn't have before. And now we have access to a much more potent version of it because of this bug fix, and also the baseline: blow up a Multiple Man, revive it with a Phoenix Force, do the exact same thing. So having access to Spider as a secondary, but only 1 turn, but still very relevant Phoenix Force adjacent card, super important to raising the floor here. Having access to Fastball Special as Carnage 2, but also as a modular card that can work really well with a giant Human Torch, also particularly relevant. Spider and Human Torch, I mean, we can see where that one's going, right? Like, that's just the kind of thing that typically is going to get pretty strong. Human Torch on 3, Spider on 4, go Spider it. And then suddenly you have a gigantic, enormous Human Torch that's 28 power after the inbuilt move from the Spider. You get to throw that at somebody, you get to revive it with a Phoenix Force. You're cooking, right? That kind of stuff is very real. This is a legitimately strong deck when it's comboing off, and you should absolutely respect it. I am still roughly here for the decks that I have been playing a lot of. I think that Super Giant is just a really clean answer to a whole lot of stuff. but I've been sort of playing around in a different space for Super Giant. So we're going to talk about two Super Giant decks here. This is the one that I did the video on. It's the one you'll kind of see a lot of, and I'm probably a decent amount responsible for that. And that means that it's kind of become a bit of the default. This is when I see a deck playing some of these cards, I expect the rest of these cards. And that's a precarious situation at the top of the ladder when your opponents are able to sort of reasonably extrapolate your 12 out of seeing like an Ascani Sun into a Debris. If I see that, I'm thinking it's going to be this 12. So what direction can you go as a Super Giant list? For a refresher, Super Giant is very much a package that can do a whole lot of stuff. A really incredible and amazing amount of mid-range decks are really only functional because of Super Giant, because Super Giant Negasonic Cosmo is the premier control package in a world defined by decks that are going exponential, decks that are combining an Invisible Woman with a Prodigy, or decks that are combining a Sholo with a Maverick, or decks that are combining a Star-Lord with 5 more Star-Lords. All of these things are weak to Super Giant, and that is what allows you to still play an incremental game of Marvel Snap. So the real thing here is, what is the best points package to play with your Super Giant? And this one's really good, but I've been messing around in a bit of a different space. I think Batroc Super Giant has a distinct advantage in Super Giant mirrors because it just has way better scalers and way more ability to manipulate priority in a Super Giant world, while also having, frankly, just a bigger guy in the form of Hydra Stomper. Like, yes, your consistent output is a little bit lower, but you're basically in the driver's seat in the mirror against that other Super Giant deck. It's dependent on what you do. And if you execute your game plan, you're gonna beat them because your cards are just bigger. And you maintain all of this awesome stuff that this deck already has access to. I've waxed poetic about Super Giant, Cosmo, and Negasonic a million times. I will continue to do so. It is unbelievably good. The fact that this used to be a Sholo shell and other Sholo shells overtook it, so now it is a Super Giant shell, that is indicative of this deck adapting to the reality of the situation, which is other decks are better able to be a Sholo deck by going multiplicative, by applying other multiplicative strategies to Sholo, whether that be the ongoing stuff that allows your Maverick to get the 15 power behind a Moonstone Captain Carter, or the activate stuff that allows your Maverick to sort of start doubling up and your Scarlet Spider to start doubling up. These are maximalist Sholo decks, and Batroc was only ever the most mid-rangey of those, and the best at being a mid-range deck with consistent output. But now that Sholo decks are building to be maximalist, you need to build to stop them. And that's what the Super Giant shell is able to do. There are almost no other packages in the entire game that give you this level of control over the game. And I strongly suspect that this list is a big time sleeper. I mean, we could talk about the Boogeyman a little bit. I think it's maybe time to talk about Sholo, why he didn't get nerfed, and all of that stuff. My largest theory is that I suspect Sholo didn't get nerfed because he's probably a card that is actually hard to play. And as much as I would like to see Sholo nerfed, because I do think that it's kind of getting a little bit old hat, that anything that doesn't work with Sholo, I've got to figure out how to make it work with Super Giant, because otherwise I can't really play the package. Like, at a certain point, we're going to hit the point of Super Giant-flation. Like, next week when Polaris comes out and I'll play an Ajax Super Giant, we're going to be like, all right, man, just relax, right? But it's largely in deference to the fact that Sholo is just naturally a little bit bigger than other mid-range stuff, and it has the ability to sort of become this maximalist combo deck too. So being able to sort of choose which direction it feels like going and be a deck that is still a little bit bigger than most mid-range decks without investing in the combo, just by like playing Sholo and a target for Sholo, not even doing all the Jocasta stuff. That modularity is really important because it allows the deck to beat up on mid-range decks, and then against combo decks that aren't playing a lot of interaction, it can become one of those in those matchups too and go power for power. This ability to sort of switch between those two modes is what defines this archetype and what has allowed it to sustain its run of success at the top. I have no doubt that it will continue to do so. As far as why Second Dinner nerfed Moondragon and Chamber instead of Sholo last OTA, My assumption is Occam's Razor, basically. I think they did that because those cards were probably higher stat cards at the meat of the curve. Like, that's basically it. I think that at this point, Sholo has sort of entered what I would like to affectionately, or maybe not so affectionately, call the move bounce zone or the Loki zone. And I don't really know how else to say this, but I didn't think he was that hard to play. But I can only, again, read the tea leaves, right? I can only sort of look at this and say, okay, well, clearly if he was a problem, they probably would have nerfed him, because if he was a problem and he was justifiable to nerf based on stats, I can't think of a good reason why they wouldn't. So Occam's Razor, I'm saying 85% chance his stats are like good but well within bounds. And then 15% chance they're like, we can't nerf this, we just sold a bundle, right? Like that. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I do kind of doubt it based on previous behavior. That said, I realize probably a decent amount of the people in my comments are like, nah, it's definitely the bundle thing, bro. I'm going to offer a hot take, and it is from someone who, like, I like playing Star-Lord. Self-admitted, I enjoy this card. I think it is a weirdly entertaining gameplay experience that I kind of can't get from anything else in this game, but I don't think this deck is very good. Like, I know it is good, but I think so much of this deck being good, so much of it is just people ignoring that they have to respect it. Like, imagine if Mr. Negative was like a really good deck and it got nerfed a little bit. Like, maybe they took like some points of power off of a Gore or whatever. But imagine it was a really good deck and they did that and everyone was just like, oh, it's fine. We were, 40% of the metagame was playing Mobius. Now 10% of the metagame is playing Mobius. Well, Mr. Negative would probably get a little bit better, even though the deck got worse. And that's basically what happened to Star-Lord. Like, I think this deck is roughly infinitely worse than it used to be. A nearly infinite amount worse than it previously was. However, almost nobody is playing the meaningful interaction for it. And obviously, I think that's changing. I talked about 2 Super Giant decks here, right? But like the Sholo decks, they're like, I don't care anymore. I'm not going to play a Cosmo just for this matchup. It's not common enough. I don't have to, right? And it's like, if you wanted to beat this matchup, you could. Like, I think both of the Super Giant decks house this deck. Dumpster. Cosmo in the mid lane, phenomenally strong against most of what this deck is trying to do. The ability to just, like, I've even been playing a bunch of, like, very mediocre Shang-Chi decks. Every single one of those very mediocre Shang-Chi decks puts this deck in a trash can because, oh, I'm playing a Star-Lord. He's got 12 power, and then I'm going to Arnim Zola him without priority on the next turn. No shot. No shot. If your opponent is playing a Cosmo, if your opponent is playing a Shang-Chi, if your opponent is playing a Cosmic Ghost Rider, you are dead. If your opponent is playing a Super Giant, you are dead. Like, there is just so much that actually puts this guy in a trash can. And I realize that it's still a good deck, but like, we are really hitting the point where I have to look at you guys and be like, can you guys at least try to beat this? Because I feel every time I play this deck like it is the most fragile thing on earth. And then I go onto my Discord and people are like, they got to nerf Star-Lord again. And I'm just like, what's happening? Like, please play a card that interacts with this guy. It is the world's easiest deck to beat if you want to interact with it. And I realize the play pattern, all those complaints are still super valid, but like, it was relatively easier to beat. Like, we know my history on this card, right? Like, I thought it was a little easier to beat than it clearly was earlier, but we are now at a point where it's just like, please interact with the card. Like, just do anything that interacts with what this deck is doing, and you will beat it. Like, please. And again, the play pattern is weird, right? Because when you do the stuff that interacts with what this deck is trying to do, you are almost always targeting specifically the Star-Lord duplication, right? And they can play games that don't involve that. And those are actually the fun games to play with this deck, personally. But if people are seriously in the world where, like, they're just getting Star-Lorded over and over, trust me, you can do something about that. Moondragon got nerfed, and so I think people are going to expect this deck to maybe disappear, but Moondragon getting nerfed is basically fine for this list. Chamber's nerf, I think, much more meaningful. I replaced Chamber with Sam Wilson because functionally, I think they're going to be roughly the same power when you play them on 2. and you're really never not playing them on 2. Like, this is a card that you're playing on 2. That's kind of what you're doing. You only run 4 5+ anyway, and you're playing at least 1-5 and 1-6 most of the games. I don't think Chamber's really measuring up anymore. Now, Sam Wilson does have an attendant downside, which is like, sometimes you actually are going to fill the board up. Like, sometimes that actually is going to matter, but I don't really know. I think this is basically a fairly reasonable way to approach what the deck is going to look like anyway. And of course, Moondragon is, still just going to be the absolute best 2 you can play in a deck like this. It's still going to be 7 or 9 a lot of the time. You don't really have to worry about her in any meaningful way. She's still going to be outputting power, but Chamber did get worse. There are some flex slots here. Like, if you don't like, for example, Sandman and Caliban, those are very replaceable cards. I think really Sandman can be, Legion or really whatever 5 you feel is best for the current meta. Caliban, I mean, you can make it, if you wanted to make the Sandman into a Cannonball and the Caliban into a Mercury, that's a totally fine thing to do as well. Just get whatever you feel like is the best stat 3 in there, and then whatever you feel like is the best tech 5 in there. And that's really all you have to do to make this deck a significant player in the metagame. I don't think these 2 points are going to be a meaningful downgrade to Doom 2099. I think it will still be able to do what it does, and I have strong belief that this will remain one of, if not the strongest decks for people in the meat of the population curve. And what I mean by that is the fact that it got nerfed, to me, is indicative that it is sort of in the opposite place to where Sholo, Move Bounce, Loki, these decks that were particularly potent at high infinite with like high levels of mechanical complexity were in. This is a deck that is an extremely low level of mechanical complexity. So it's Surtur, it's Darkhawk. These are cards that typically get over nerfed when you compare to the high infinite level. So whenever a deck like this is really legit at the high infinite level, which Doom 2099 undoubtedly is, it means that for about 80% of the population that isn't high infinite, it's probably just going to be the best deck in the game because you're going to be making mostly the same decisions as a really good player. And it's really good even if you are playing against people who are significantly better than the players you're playing against. And so that means that this is overwhelmingly a deck that if you're going to watch this video and come away like, Cam thinks I should be playing this, I think the majority of people in Marvel Snap, this is probably the best deck they can play. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.